The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered behind the metal barriers, cameras ready to capture the iconic changing of the guard. Among the crowd stood Margaret Whitmore, a middle-aged American tourist wearing an expensive designer outfit and oversized sunglasses that screamed wealth and status. She had arrived in London 3 days ago with her daughter Emily, a quiet 22-year-old who seemed to shrink smaller. With each passing moment in her mother's presence, Margaret had spent the entire morning complaining about everything from the hotel breakfast to the traffic to the weather. Nothing met her standards, and she made sure everyone within earshot knew about it. Her voice carried across the crowd as she criticized the palace architecture, calling it outdated and overrated. Emily stood beside her mother, clutching her phone and wishing she could disappear into the crowd of excited tourists who were actually enjoying the experience. The Queen's Guard stood at attention near the palace gates, their red tunics pristine and their bearskin hats perfectly positioned. These soldiers were members of the elite infantry regiments serving the British monarchy, trained professionals who took their duties seriously. Despite popular belief, they were not just ceremonial figures, but active soldiers who had often served in combat zones around the world. Their stoic silence and unwavering stance were part of centuries-old tradition, a display of discipline and dedication that drew millions of visitors each year. Margaret pushed her way closer to the barriers, elbowing past a family with small children who had been waiting patiently for over an hour. She wanted the perfect photograph, the kind that would make her friends back home jealous when she posted it on social media. Her expensive camera hung around her neck, and she held her phone in one hand, ready to capture every angle. Emily followed reluctantly, apologizing quietly to the people her mother had displaced. One particular guard stood nearby, his posture impeccable and his gaze fixed straight ahead. His name was Lance Corporal James Morrison, though the crowd would never know that. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been selected for the prestigious duty of guarding the royal residence based on his exemplary record. Behind his stoic expression lay a sharp mind constantly aware of his surroundings, trained to identify potential threats while maintaining the ceremonial dignity his role required. Margaret studied the guard with an entitled smirk, the kind worn by someone who believed rules applied to everyone except themselves. She had read somewhere that these guards were not allowed to move or speak, and she intended to test that theory. In her mind, they were nothing more than living statues, props for tourist entertainment rather than real soldiers deserving of respect. She lifted her camera and snapped several photos, moving closer to the barrier with each shot. Other tourists maintained a respectful distance, understanding the boundaries that separated them from the guards. But Margaret had never been good with boundaries. She believed her money and status gave her special privileges, a mindset that had caused problems throughout her life but had rarely resulted in real consequences. Emily tugged gently on her mother's sleeve and whispered that they should move back, that they were getting too close. Margaret shook her off with an annoyed gesture, her focus entirely on getting the shot she wanted. She leaned over the barrier, trying to position herself directly in front of the guard. Her shadow fell across James Morrison's polished boots, but he remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on the middle distance as protocol demanded. The crowd around them had begun to notice Margaret's behavior, and several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few parents pulled their children back, sensing that something unpleasant might be about to happen. An elderly British couple shook their heads disapprovingly, muttering about tourists with no manners. But Margaret remained oblivious to the social cues. Too absorbed in her own agenda to notice the growing tension, she circled around to get a different angle, her expensive shoes clicking loudly on the cobblestones. Then she did something that made several onlookers gasp. She stepped over the barrier, crossing the clearly marked line that separated the public from the guarded area. Emily called out softly, pleading with her mother to come back, but Margaret waved her off dismissively. She wanted a selfie with the guard standing right behind her, close enough to make it look like they were posing together. James Morrison remained motionless as Margaret positioned herself uncomfortably close to him, her back nearly touching his uniform. She held up her phone, adjusting the angle to get them both in the frame. Click. Another photo. then another. She was grinning widely, thrilled with herself for being bold enough to break the rules while everyone else followed them like sheep. But Margaret was not satisfied yet. She wanted something more dramatic, something that would really stand out. She turned to face the guard directly, standing mere inches from him, and waved her hand in front of his face. When he did not react, she laughed loudly and looked back at the crowd as if expecting applause for her cleverness. Emily had covered her face with her hands, mortified beyond words. Then Margaret made her critical mistake. Emboldened by the guard's silence and stillness, she reached out and poked him in the chest with her manicured finger. It was not a gentle tap, but a firm jab, the kind meant to provoke a reaction. She poked him again, harder this time, laughing as she did so. The crowd had gone quiet now. Watching with a mixture of shock and secondhand embarrassment, James Morrison felt each poke through his thick red tunic. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of his growing irritation. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, people who tested boundaries or tried to make the guards laugh or move. But physical contact was a serious breach, one that could not be ignored. His training covered exactly this scenario, and he knew precisely what he was authorized to do. Margaret, interpreting his continued stillness as submission, grew even bolder. She grabbed the sleeve of his tunic and gave it a small tug, as if testing whether he was real. This action crossed a line from disrespectful behavior into physical assault on a member of the armed forces. Several tourists had begun recording on their phones now, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Emily had started crying silently, pulling at her mother's other arm and begging her to stop. But Margaret was too caught up in her performance, too confident in her immunity from consequences. She had gotten away with entitled behavior her entire life, smoothing over problems with money and lawyers and sheer force of personality. She assumed this situation would be no different. What Margaret did not understand was that these guards operated under specific rules of engagement. They were authorized to respond to threats and physical interference with appropriate force. More importantly, they were highly trained soldiers who took their duty seriously, not theme park employees who had to smile and accept abuse from customers. The tourist crowd might see ceremonial uniforms, but James Morrison wore the uniform of a combat veteran protecting one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom. The moment Margaret's hand made contact with his rifle, everything changed. She had reached out thoughtlessly, perhaps intending to pose with the weapon, her fingers wrapping around the barrel. This was the final straw, the act that transformed an obnoxious tourist into a legitimate security concern. James Morrison's training kicked in instantly, his body moving with the precision of countless hours of drill and real-world experience. What happened next occurred so quickly that many spectators would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. James Morrison moved with startling speed for someone who had been standing perfectly still moments before. His voice rang out sharp and commanding, cutting through the morning air like a blade. The words were not polite or gentle, but carried the full authority of a soldier addressing a threat. Margaret jumped backward, startled by the sudden transformation of the silent statue into a very real and very angry soldier. Her phone clattered to the ground, the screen cracking against the cobblestones. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people instinctively stepped back. Emily rushed forward and grabbed her mother's arm, finally succeeding in pulling her away from the guard and back behind the barrier. But the damage had been done, and Margaret Whitmore was not someone who accepted being yelled at quietly. Her face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. She had been humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses. Her phone was broken, and her perfectly curated image of sophistication had shattered along with her screen. Instead of apologizing or recognizing her mistake, Margaret did what she always did when confronted with consequences. She went on the attack. She began shouting at the guard, her voice shrill and demanding. She called him rude and aggressive, claimed he had frightened her deliberately, and insisted that she would be filing a formal complaint. Other tourists stared in disbelief as Margaret's tirade continued, her words becoming increasingly hostile. She threatened to contact the American embassy, to write to her congressman, to ensure that this soldier lost his position for daring to speak to her that way. James Morrison had returned to his position of attention, his face once again an impassive mask. But other guards nearby had witnessed the incident, and protocol was now in motion. A palace security officer was already approaching, having been alerted by the commotion. The officer, a woman named Inspector Sarah Chen, had over 15 years of experience dealing with difficult visitors and quickly assessed the situation. Inspector Chen spoke calmly to Margaret, explaining that physical contact with the guards was strictly prohibited and that touching their weapons was considered a serious security breach. Margaret refused to listen, instead launching into a renewed attack on both the guard and now the inspector. She demanded to speak to whoever was in charge, insisting that she had done nothing wrong and that the guard had overreacted to a harmless tourist taking photographs. Emily stood nearby, tears streaming down her face as she watched her mother make the situation worse with every word. She had spent her entire life watching her mother bulldoze through social situations, using aggression and entitlement to get her way, but this felt different. The people around them were not intimidated by Margaret's behavior. Instead, they looked disgusted and angry. Several tourists who had recorded the incident approached Inspector Chen, offering to provide their footage as evidence of what had actually occurred. An elderly gentleman from Scotland stepped forward and stated clearly that the American woman had crossed the barrier, harassed the guard, and touched both his uniform and weapon. Others nodded in agreement, their sympathy entirely with the soldier who had been assaulted while performing his duty. Margaret seemed genuinely shocked that strangers were not taking her side. She turned on them as well, accusing them of ganging up on her and defending their outdated military traditions. She made sweeping statements about how things were different in America, where soldiers were trained to be friendly and accommodating. Her words revealed a profound misunderstanding of both military protocol and basic human decency. Inspector Chen remained professional but firm, explaining that Margaret would need to come to the security office to provide a statement about the incident. The way she phrased it made clear this was not a request, but a requirement. Margaret refused, stating she had done nothing wrong and demanding that she be allowed to continue her tour. The inspector's expression hardened, slightly as she explained that refusing to cooperate would result in Margaret being detained and potentially arrested. The word arrested seemed to finally penetrate Margaret's anger. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across her face. Emily seized the opportunity, begging her mother to just cooperate and apologize so they could leave. But Margaret's pride would not allow for an apology, even when faced with potential legal consequences. She agreed to go to the security office, but made clear she was doing so under protest. As Inspector Chen escorted Margaret toward the palace security building, a crowd had gathered. Some tourists applauded the guard's actions, showing their support for the soldier who had been harassed. A few shouted words of encouragement to him, thanking him for his service. James Morrison remained at his post, his expression unchanged, but those who knew him well might have detected the slightest tension in his jaw that suggested his internal frustration. Inside the security office, Margaret was shown to a small interview room with plain walls and a table with 2 chairs. Inspector Chen explained that the incident was being taken very seriously because it involved physical contact with an armed soldier on duty. Margaret scoffed at this description, insisting she had barely touched him and that everyone was overreacting. She demanded to call the American embassy immediately. The inspector informed her she was certainly allowed to contact the embassy, but that doing so would not change the facts of what had occurred or the potential consequences. She explained that assault on a member of the armed forces was a criminal offense under British law, that touching a soldier's weapon could be interpreted as an attempt to disarm them or as a security threat. Margaret's face paled as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Emily sat beside her mother, exhausted and humiliated. She had always known her mother could be difficult, but she had never imagined she would witness something like this. As Inspector Chen left the room to review the video footage from both security cameras and tourist phones, Emily finally spoke up. She told her mother that she had been wrong. She had been rude and disrespectful, and that she needed to apologize. Margaret turned on her daughter with venom, accusing her of being ungrateful and disloyal. She ranted about how she had paid for this entire trip, how she was only trying to get good photographs, and how everyone was treating her like a criminal for something that would barely register as an incident back home. Emily shrank back into her chair. The familiar pattern of her mother's blame shifting, washing over her. After nearly 20 minutes, Inspector Chen returned with a tablet displaying several video clips. She placed it on the table and played the footage without comment. Margaret watched herself push through the crowd. Step over the barrier, harass the guard, poke him repeatedly, and finally grab his rifle. Viewed objectively, her behavior looked even worse than it had felt in the moment. There was no ambiguity about who had initiated the contact or who had been in the wrong. The inspector explained that based on this evidence, Margaret could be charged with assault, disturbing the peace, and potentially interfering with military operations. Each charge carried potential fines and even jail time under British law. She could also be banned from royal properties for life and face difficulties entering the United Kingdom in the future. The words hung in the air as Margaret processed what she was hearing. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitmore felt genuine fear. She had assumed her American citizenship would somehow protect her. That being a tourist would grant her special leniency. But Inspector Chen's steady gaze and professional demeanor made clear that no such leniency would be forthcoming. The United Kingdom had laws, and those laws applied to everyone equally, regardless of nationality or perceived social status. Emily watched her mother's expression change from defiance to worry to something approaching panic. She felt a complicated mix of sympathy and satisfaction. Part of her wanted to comfort her mother, but another part thought this consequence was long overdue. Margaret had spent decades treating service workers, employees, and anyone she considered beneath her with contempt. Perhaps finally facing real accountability would teach her something. Inspector Chen offered Margaret a choice. She could accept a formal warning, pay a substantial fine, issue a written apology to Lance Corporal Morrison, and agree to a ban from all royal properties for 2 years. Alternatively, she could refuse these terms and face formal charges that would be processed through the courts. The inspector made clear that if Margaret chose the court route, the penalties would likely be much more severe, and she would need to remain in London until the case was resolved. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she considered her options. Her mind raced through potential scenarios, each worse than the last. Being stuck in London for weeks or months while facing criminal charges would be devastating both personally and professionally. Her friends and business associates would find out. The story might make the news. Her carefully constructed image would be destroyed. All because of a few minutes of thoughtless behavior? Emily placed her hand gently on her mother's arm and whispered that she should accept the warning and apologize. Margaret jerked her arm away but said nothing, her expression conflicted. Inspector Chen waited patiently, having seen this internal battle play out many times before. Some people learned from their mistakes. Others simply learned to hide their behavior better. She suspected Margaret fell into the latter category but hoped she might be wrong. The silence in the interview room stretched on for several minutes as Margaret wrestled with her pride. Everything in her nature resisted the idea of apologizing or admitting wrongdoing. She had built her entire identity around being right, around forcing the world to accommodate her rather than adjusting her behavior. But the alternative Inspector Chen presented was simply unacceptable. She could not afford a criminal record or the public humiliation of a court case. Through gritted teeth, Margaret finally agreed to the terms. She would pay the fine, accept the ban from royal properties, and write an apology letter. Inspector Chen nodded and produced several forms that required Margaret's signature. As Margaret read through the documents, the reality of her situation became increasingly clear. She was being officially documented as someone who had assaulted a member of the armed forces. This record would exist permanently, accessible to immigration officials and law enforcement. Emily felt a small sense of relief that her mother had chosen the sensible option, even if it was clearly killing her pride to do so. But as they began the process of completing the paperwork, Emily noticed something troubling. Her mother was signing the forms but making small comments under her breath. Dismissive remarks suggesting she still did not believe she had done anything truly wrong. The apology would be given, but it would not be genuine. Inspector Chen completed her portion of the documentation and then explained the next step. Margaret would need to write her apology letter immediately, and it would need to be reviewed before being accepted. The letter had to acknowledge specific actions that were inappropriate, express genuine remorse, and commit to respecting military personnel in the future. She provided Margaret with paper and a pen, then left the room to give her privacy to write. Margaret stared at the blank paper with undisguised resentment. She had not written an apology for anything in decades, and the idea of crafting one now felt like the ultimate defeat. She picked up the pen and began writing quickly, producing a brief and obviously insincere note that barely acknowledged any wrongdoing. Emily read over her mother's shoulder and immediately shook her head. Knowing it would never be accepted, Emily took the pen from her mother's hand and sat down to help. She explained, gently but firmly, that the apology needed to be real, that Inspector Chen would see through anything fake, and that this was their only chance to resolve things without going to court. Margaret wanted to argue, but could see the determination in her daughter's eyes. It was one of the rare moments when Emily stood up to her mother. Margaret found herself without the energy to fight back. Together, they crafted a more appropriate letter. Emily wrote most of it while Margaret watched, occasionally suggesting changes that made the tone slightly less apologetic. The final version acknowledged that Margaret had crossed barriers, made physical contact with the guard, and failed to show proper respect for someone serving his country. It expressed regret for the disruption caused, and promised to be more mindful of cultural expectations and rules when traveling abroad. When Inspector Chen returned and read the letter, she studied it carefully before nodding with cautious approval. It was not the most heartfelt apology she had ever seen, but it met the minimum requirements. She explained that the letter would be provided to Lance Corporal Morrison, and that Margaret's acceptance of the terms would be logged in the system. The fine could be paid immediately by credit card or within 7 days by bank transfer. Margaret chose to pay immediately, wanting to be done with the entire humiliating experience as quickly as possible. She handed over her credit card and watched the numbers appear on the payment screen with visible pain. The fine was substantial, enough to hurt even someone with Margaret's financial resources. Inspector Chen processed the payment without comment, printed a receipt, and added it to the growing file of documentation. The final step was the formal delivery of the written apology to the guard. Inspector Chen explained that Margaret would not need to deliver it personally, something that came as a visible relief to both Margaret and Emily. Instead, the letter would be provided to Lance Corporal Morrison through official channels, and he would have the option to accept or reject it. If he rejected it, the matter would automatically proceed to formal charges. This possibility had not occurred to Margaret, and her face showed alarm as she processed the information. Inspector Chen explained that while most soldiers accepted appropriate apologies as part of their duty, Morrison would be within his rights to insist on formal prosecution given the severity of the physical contact. Margaret wanted to protest that she should have been told this earlier, but she recognized that further complaints would only make things worse. They were required to wait in the security office while the apology was reviewed by Morrison's commanding officer and then presented to the guard himself. Emily suggested they use the time to contact their hotel and adjust their plans for the day. Margaret sat rigidly in her chair, staring at the wall and clearly running through worst-case scenarios in her mind. She had always been someone who needed control, the uncertainty of waiting for someone. Elsa's decision was torture. Nearly an hour passed before Inspector Chen returned with an update. Lance Corporal Morrison had read the apology and, after consideration, had decided to accept it. The matter would be closed with the agreed-upon penalties and would not proceed to criminal charges. Margaret exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, while Emily felt tears of relief forming in her eyes. However, Inspector Chen was not finished. She explained that while Morrison had accepted the apology, he had also provided a statement about the incident that would remain on file. In his statement, he noted that this was not the first time tourists had crossed boundaries or shown disrespect, but it was among the more aggressive incidents he had personally experienced. He expressed concern that the increasing boldness of some visitors was creating genuine security risks and disrupting the ceremonial duties that honored centuries of military tradition. Inspector Chen read portions of the statement aloud, and Emily could see her mother's face redden with a mixture of shame and suppressed anger. Morrison had written with measured professionalism, avoiding personal attacks but making clear the impact of Margaret's actions. He noted that while tourists often treated the guards as attractions rather than soldiers, most maintained respectful boundaries. Margaret's behavior had crossed from ignorance into deliberate aggression, making it difficult to maintain. His duty in requiring intervention from security personnel. The statement concluded by expressing Morrison's hope that increased awareness about the role and dignity of ceremonial guards might prevent similar incidents in the future. He noted that he had accepted the apology in the spirit of international goodwill, but requested that the circumstances be used for educational purposes. Inspector Chen explained that Margaret's case would indeed become part of training materials for both security, staff, and public information campaigns about appropriate behavior around royal guards. Margaret's humiliation was now complete. Not only had she been caught, fined, and forced to apologize, but her behavior would be used as an example of what not to do. She would be the cautionary tale shared with other tourists, the person whose actions demonstrated the worst of entitled visitor behavior. Emily could see her mother processing this information, and she wondered whether it would lead to any genuine self-reflection or simply to more bitterness. Inspector Chen provided them with final documentation, including copies of all the forms Margaret had signed and a formal letter confirming her ban from royal properties. She explained that this ban was recorded in multiple databases and would be enforced at all royal residences, not just Buckingham Palace. If Margaret attempted to enter any banned location during the 2-year period, she would be immediately removed and could face additional charges for violating the terms of her agreement as they prepared to leave. Inspector Chen offered one final piece of advice. She suggested that Margaret take time to reflect on why she had felt entitled to behave as she did and whether similar patterns existed in other areas of her life. The comment was delivered professionally but carried an unmistakable subtext. Emily glanced at her mother, wondering if she would explode at this presumptuous observation, but Margaret simply nodded curtly and gathered her things. They exited the security office into the bright afternoon sunlight. The crowds of tourists had changed completely from the morning, new groups having replaced those who had witnessed Margaret's humiliation. Emily suggested they return to the hotel and rest, but Margaret insisted they continue sightseeing. She refused to let this incident completely ruin their trip, even though it was clear her heart was no longer in it. As they walked through London's streets, Margaret was noticeably subdued. She did not complain about the food vendors, or criticize the architecture, or push past other pedestrians. Emily wondered if this might represent a turning point, a moment when her mother finally recognized that her behavior had consequences. But she had hoped for such changes before, only to watch her mother return to old patterns once the immediate crisis passed. They visited the Tower of London that afternoon, maintaining careful distance from the beefeaters and other ceremonial guards. Margaret took photographs from appropriate distances and did not attempt to interact with any of the guards. She followed rules, read signs, and stayed behind barriers. To the casual observer, she appeared to be a normal, respectful tourist. Only Emily knew the effort this restraint required and the simmering resentment behind her mother's careful compliance. That evening, back at their hotel, Margaret finally broke her silence. She complained bitterly about the entire experience, characterizing herself as the victim of an overreaction to innocent behavior. She insisted that in America, such an incident would never have escalated so far, and that British authorities were unnecessarily rigid and hostile to tourists. Emily listened without responding, recognizing that her mother was reconstructing the narrative to preserve her self-image. What Margaret could not change, however, was the fact that the incident had been recorded by dozens of tourists. Within hours of returning to their hotel, Emily began seeing the videos appear online. Social media posts with titles like "Entitled Tourist Attacks," "Royal Guard," and "American Woman Learns." British guards or real soldiers were spreading rapidly. The footage showed Margaret's behavior clearly. The comments sections were universally critical of her actions. Emily discovered the videos, scrolling through her phone before dinner. Her stomach dropped as she recognized her mother in clip after clip, each one showing the incident from a different angle. Some videos had hundreds of thousands of views already, and they were being shared across multiple platforms. The comments ranged from mocking to outraged, with people from around the world weighing in on Margaret's behavior and expressing support for the guard. She debated whether to show her mother, knowing it would trigger an explosive reaction. But Margaret discovered the videos on her own later that evening when she searched for information about royal guards on her tablet. She found herself staring at her own face. Frozen in the moment of poking the guard's chest, her expression captured in unflattering detail. The comments beneath the videos were brutal, calling her a Karen, an ugly American, and far worse things. Margaret's face cycled through several shades of red as she read comment after comment. She tried to report the videos for invasion of privacy, but the platforms rejected her complaints. The videos had been taken in public spaces where she had no reasonable expectation of privacy, and the incident was considered newsworthy. Several British news websites had even picked up the story, running articles about tourist behavior at royal sites with Margaret's incident as the primary example. Emily watched her mother spiral through denial, anger, and finally, a kind of shocked silence. The scale of the public reaction was something neither of them had anticipated. Margaret was being mocked and criticized by millions of strangers, her face and name now permanently associated with entitled tourist behavior. The humiliation she had felt in the security office paled in comparison to this global public shaming. The next morning, Margaret received a phone call from her boss back in the United States. Someone at her company had seen the videos and recognized her. Her boss was calling to express concern about the incident and its potential impact on the company's reputation. Margaret tried to downplay what had happened, but her boss had seen the videos and was not interested in excuses. He suggested strongly that Margaret take some time off when she returned home and work with public relations to manage the situation. Emily could hear her mother's side of the conversation from the next room, the initial defensiveness giving way to desperate attempts at explanation. When the call ended, Margaret looked shaken in a way Emily had never seen before. The consequences were no longer abstract or confined to London. They had followed her across the Atlantic and were now threatening her professional life as well as her reputation. Their remaining days in London were subdued. Margaret canceled several planned activities, particularly those involving any royal sites or military locations. She wore sunglasses and a hat whenever they went out, paranoid that someone might recognize her from the videos. Emily suggested they cut their trip short and return home early, but Margaret refused, insisting that would be letting the situation defeat her completely. They spent most of their time in museums and theaters, places where crowds were quiet and focused on art rather than on each other. Margaret was on her best behavior everywhere they went, hyper-aware of how her actions might be perceived. She was polite to servers, apologized when she accidentally bumped into people, and thanked anyone who held a door open for her. It was the most considerate Emily had ever seen her mother behave in public. But in private moments, Margaret's true feelings emerged. She ranted about cancel culture and social media mobs, about people with nothing better to do than tear down successful women. She insisted that what she had done was not that bad, that the guard could have simply ignored her, and that the entire situation had been blown out of proportion. Emily listened quietly, recognizing that her mother was still unable to accept genuine responsibility for her actions. The flight home was tense and quiet. Margaret drank more wine than usual and stared out the window at the clouds, clearly lost in unpleasant thoughts. Emily tried to read but found herself distracted by worry about what awaited them back home. She knew her mother's friends would have questions, that the videos might have reached people in their social circle, and that things would be uncomfortable for a while. When they landed in New York, Margaret turned her phone back on to find dozens of messages waiting. Some were from concerned friends, asking if the woman in the viral videos was really her. Others were from business associates and clients who had seen the story and wanted to know if it would affect their working relationships. Several messages were from journalists requesting interviews or comments about the incident. Margaret's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. She had spent years building a reputation as a sophisticated, successful businesswoman and socialite. Now that image was being replaced by the unflattering videos showing her harassing a soldier. No amount of money or connections could make this story disappear. The internet was forever, and her moment of entitled behavior had been permanently documented for the world to see over the following weeks. Margaret discovered just how far the consequences would extend. Several of her social clubs received complaints from members who found her behavior embarrassing and wanted her removed. Her company decided it would be best if she took an extended leave of absence while public interest in the story died down. Friends became distant, either out of embarrassment or disapproval, and social invitations dried up almost completely. Emily watched her mother struggle with this social exile. Her feelings remained complicated. Part of her felt sympathy for the woman who had raised her, seeing her mother genuinely suffering for the first time in memory. But another part felt that these consequences were justified and perhaps necessary. Her mother had spent decades treating people poorly with no accountability. Maybe this public humiliation would finally teach her something about respect and boundaries. The incident also forced Emily to confront her own enabling behavior. She had spent her whole life making excuses for her mother, smoothing over conflicts, and apologizing on Margaret's behalf. She had been so focused on keeping the peace that she had never demanded her mother actually change. The incident at Buckingham Palace had been a wake-up call for Emily as well, showing her the endpoint of unchecked entitled behavior. Margaret eventually returned to work, but things were never quite the same. Colleagues treated her differently, with a mixture of caution and barely concealed judgment. Some clients requested to work with other representatives from the company, uncomfortable associating their brands with someone who had become a viral symbol of tourist misbehavior. Margaret's career, which had once seemed unstoppable, had been seriously damaged by a few minutes of thoughtlessness. The psychological impact ran even deeper. Margaret had always derived her sense of self-worth from external validation, from being seen as important and successful. The videos and the public mockery had stripped that away, forcing her to confront how she was actually perceived by others. The realization that millions of people found her behavior appalling was deeply unsettling in a way that private criticism had never been. 6 months after the incident, Margaret and Emily were having dinner together when the conversation turned unexpectedly to the trip. Margaret was quiet for a moment before admitting that she still thought about it regularly. She confessed that watching herself in those videos had been disturbing, that she had not recognized the person she saw. The comment was not quite an apology or an admission of complete fault, but it was the closest Margaret had come to genuine self-reflection. Emily asked her mother what she wished she had done differently. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. She said she wished she had listened when Emily told her to stop, that she had respected the barriers and rules instead of assuming they did not apply to her. She admitted that her behavior had been inappropriate, though she still seemed unable to fully articulate why it had been wrong beyond the consequences it caused her personally. The incident became a defining moment in both their lives, referenced in different ways depending on the audience. To Margaret's diminished social circle, it was an unfortunate mishap that had been blown out of proportion by social media. To Emily's friends, it was a cautionary tale about toxic parenting and entitled behavior. To the millions of people online who had watched the videos, it was a satisfying example of someone finally facing consequences for treating others poorly. Lance Corporal James Morrison, meanwhile, had returned to his normal duties with little fanfare. His superiors had commended him for his professional handling of a difficult situation, and his fellow guards had supported him throughout the aftermath. He gave one brief interview to a military publication about the incident, using it as an opportunity to educate the public about the real role of ceremonial guards and the importance of treating military personnel with respect. In that interview, Morrison was asked whether he had any message for Margaret Whitmore. He paused before responding that he hoped the experience had taught her something valuable about respect for others, regardless of their role or uniform. He noted that everyone makes mistakes, but that personal growth comes from acknowledging those mistakes and genuinely changing behavior rather than simply avoiding consequences. The interview circulated online and was seen by Margaret, who read it multiple times. Morrison's measured response, neither vindictive nor condescending, somehow made her feel worse than the harsh comments from strangers. He had been the one physically harassed, yet he was the one extending understanding and hoping for her growth. The grace in his response highlighted how far short she had fallen in her own behavior and response. As time passed, the videos gradually faded from viral status, replaced by newer content and fresher scandals. But they never disappeared entirely. They remained searchable, permanent records of Margaret's worst moment available to anyone who looked for them. She learned to live with this reality, though it never stopped bothering her completely. Sometimes she would search for the videos herself, a form of self-punishment or perhaps an attempt to desensitize herself to the images. Emily eventually moved across the country and put some healthy distance between herself and her mother. Their relationship improved somewhat with the physical separation, though it remained complicated. Emily had learned that she could not change her mother, but she could control her own boundaries and responses. The incident had been painful, but it had also been clarifying, showing Emily patterns she needed to break in her own life. Margaret's life slowly stabilized into a new normal, one where she was more careful about her public behavior, but still struggled with genuine empathy and self-awareness. She attended a few therapy sessions, but stopped going when the therapist pushed her to examine deeper patterns rather than just managing public relations. Real change, it turned out, required more vulnerability than Margaret was willing or able to embrace. The story of the entitled woman who struck a British royal guard became one of those internet legends, periodically resurfacing when discussions turned to tourist behavior or the importance of respecting cultural traditions. New videos would reference it, articles would cite it as an example, and people would share it with comments about how it still remained relevant. Margaret's brief moment of entitlement had achieved a kind of immortality, far beyond anything she could have imagined when she crossed that barrier on a sunny morning in London. For James Morrison, the incident became a minor footnote in a distinguished military career. He continued serving with honor, eventually moving on to other assignments and responsibilities. When asked about the viral video years later, he would shrug and note that dealing with difficult people was part of the job, whether on ceremonial duty or in active service. He bore no grudge against Margaret Whitmore. Having encountered many people in his life who struggled to see beyond their own perspectives, the incident ultimately became exactly what Inspector Chen had hoped it would be when she accepted Margaret's apology. It became educational, a clear example of boundaries and consequences that could be pointed to and learned from. Thousands of tourists visited royal sites with more awareness of appropriate behavior, because they had seen what happened when someone crossed the line. Ceremonial guards were treated with slightly more respect, their role better understood as serious military duty rather than just tourist entertainment in the end. The story was less about one woman's bad behavior and more about the broader questions it raised. Questions about entitlement and accountability, about the gap between how we see ourselves and how others see us, about the permanence of digital documentation and the power of collective judgment. Margaret Whitmore had become an unwitting case study in these issues, her face and actions forever tied to a moment she would rather forget but could never escape.